Most people know the story of Centralia as a cautionary tale about an unstoppable subterranean fire, a town swallowed by its own bad luck and corporate neglect. We are comforted by the official timeline, which tells us that the danger was thoroughly mapped, the risks calculated, and the perimeter safely drawn before the final residents were moved away. But when you look closely at the actual paperwork left behind by the federal survey teams, a different narrative begins to take shape. There are places where the ink changes, where numbers don't quite add up, and where the lines on the topographic charts stop precisely where they should have kept going. The morning sun over Columbia County always carried a heavy, gray tint, even in the middle of summer. Raymond adjusted the side mirror of his government-issued station wagon, watching the asphalt of Route 61 slowly crack and warp in his rearview mirror. His job was simple on paper: verify the northern markers established by the 1974 geological team and log any new thermal fractures. But the air here felt different than it did in Harrisburg, thick with the scent of wet coal and something else he couldn't quite name. He pulled over near a collapsed chain-link fence where the old borough limits used to be. A faded sign warned of underground gases, its white paint peeling off in long, brittle strips that fluttered in the light breeze. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic tick of his cooling engine and the distant, hollow cawing of a single crow. He checked his clipboard, noting that this specific coordinate had been marked for a secondary inspection 3 years ago, yet no follow-up report existed in the central archive. Walking along the shoulder of the abandoned road, Raymond noticed how the vegetation changed. On his left, the hemlocks were green and dense, but on his right, the earth was strangely bare, dusted with a fine layer of white ash that resembled an unseasonal frost. He stopped to press his palm against an exposed patch of shale near a drainage ditch. It wasn't hot, or even warm, but the rock possessed a faint, vibrating hum that felt like a distant generator running deep beneath the soles of his boots. The manual he carried was a thick blue binder filled with mimeographed maps from the Bureau of Mines. On page 42, a red ink line indicated the estimated perimeter of the subterranean burn, but someone had drawn a heavy black crosshatch over a 3-acre section just north of the state park boundary. A handwritten note in the margin simply read, "Inconclusive reading. Route abandoned." There was no signature, no date, and no explanation for why a professional survey team would leave a sector completely unmeasured. He followed the overgrown path that led toward the old water reservoir, a place that should have been entirely dry according to the latest federal briefs. Instead, he found a perfectly still pool of dark, brackish water reflecting the overcast sky like a sheet of dirty glass. Dead oak trees stood like gray pillars around the perimeter, their roots submerged in the murky depths. According to his topographic guide, this entire basin had been declared structurally unstable and filled with gravel back in 1978. Sitting on a rotting log, Raymond pulled out his brass compass to take a bearing toward the nearest benchmark tower. The needle swung erratically, spinning 3 full circles before settling on a direction that was nearly 30 degrees off from true north. He tapped the glass casing with his thumb, thinking it might be a simple mechanical failure, but the needle remained stubbornly fixed on the empty ridge to his right. He logged the anomaly in his notebook, his handwriting looking uncomfortably shaky on the clean white page. Further down the ridge, he discovered a small concrete equipment shed that hadn't been recorded on any of his contemporary zoning maps. The wooden door hung loosely from a single rusted hinge, groaning softly whenever the wind picked up from the valley below. Inside, the floor was littered with broken core sample tubes and discarded plastic wrappers from the early 80s. A metal filing cabinet sat in the corner, its drawers pried open and entirely empty, except for a thick layer of fine gray dust. He shone his flashlight into the dark corners of the shed, catching the glint of something metallic buried beneath a pile of rotted canvas. It was an old borehole thermometer, its long copper probe bent at a sharp angle as if it had been dropped in a hurry. The glass dial was cracked, but the indicator needle was frozen at 74 degrees Fahrenheit, a perfectly normal temperature that didn't match the emergency evacuation protocols described in the site's historical overview. Outside, the mist began to roll down from the higher ridges, swallowing the tops of the dead hemlocks in a pale, featureless blanket. Raymond walked back toward the station wagon, his boots crunching loudly on the brittle earth. He couldn't shake the impression that the landscape was actively shifting, not through tectonic violence, but through a quiet, deliberate reorganization of its own geometry. When he reached the car, he looked back at the shed, only to find it completely obscured by the rising fog. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, watching the vapor press against the windshield. The radio hissed with static, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to sync perfectly with the vibration he had felt in the shale earlier that morning. He turned the dial, searching for a local station from Bloomsburg, but found nothing but that same steady, breathing white noise across the entire AM band. He put the car in gear, knowing he had 5 more coordinates to check before the sun dropped behind the mountain. The next marker was located near an old railroad grade that had been torn up during the initial relocation efforts. Here, the ground was dry and deeply fissured, with narrow cracks venting thin, odorless plumes of heat into the damp afternoon air. Raymond stood over one of the fissures, expecting the suffocating smell of sulfur, but the air rising from the deep crack was crisp and cold, like the draft from an underground cavern that had never seen the sun. He checked his master logbook, cross-referencing the coordinates of the railroad grade with the regional surveyor's records from 1976. The page for this sector had been cleanly cut out with a razor blade, leaving only a thin sliver of paper along the stitched binding. On that remaining fragment, a single sentence fragment was visible in faded purple type, extension verified, but not logged per district directive. He touched the cut edge, wondering how many other pages had been removed before the binders were archived. As twilight began to settle over the valley, Raymond reached the edge of what used to be the town's residential district. Sidewalks ended abruptly in walls of dense briars, and fire hydrants stood like lonely sentinels in fields of goldenrod. He stopped beside a concrete foundation where a house had been neatly dismantled and hauled away decades ago. In the center of the basement floor, someone had painted a large, crude circle in white traffic paint, with a series of small, precise numbers scrawled along its outer rim. He knelt down to read the painted figures, recognizing them as old GPS coordinates that predated the commercial availability of the technology by several years. The paint was remarkably fresh, showing none of the weathering or flaking that covered the surrounding concrete walls. He reached out to touch the white lines, but stopped when he noticed a small, leather-bound field journal tucked into a crevice where the foundation wall met the dirt. The journal's cover was stiff from age and dampness, but the pages inside were dry and legible. The handwriting belonged to a junior engineer named Miller, dated between November and December of 1983. The entries described routine thermal monitoring at first, but the language quickly grew sparse and clinical, stripped of any personal observations or casual remarks. The final entry, written in a hurried, heavy hand, consisted of a single coordinates list that matched no known grid in the state of Pennsylvania. Raymond turned his flashlight toward the final page of Miller's journal, the beam illuminating the uneven margins and the heavy, indented lines where the pen had nearly punctured the paper. Below the unfamiliar coordinates, a simple sketch depicted 3 intersecting lines forming a narrow triangle over what should have been the southern ridge of the town. A single word was written in the center of the geometric shape, crossed out so thoroughly with black ink that the paper had warped into a stiff, shiny blister. He slipped the small book into his jacket pocket, the weight of the leather pressing flat against his chest as he climbed out of the empty basement foundation. The air had grown perceptibly colder in the last 20 minutes, dropping with a suddenness that didn't align with the midsummer forecast he had checked before leaving the district office. His breath began to form faint, wispy clouds in front of his face, drifting sideways toward the south despite the wind blowing steadily from the opposite direction. Returning to the station wagon, he found the vehicle's interior covered in a very thin, uniform layer of dark sediment that had somehow bypassed the closed windows and rubber door seals. It coated the vinyl dashboard, the steering wheel, and the blank pages of his official logbook like a heavy layer of soot from a chimney. He wiped a finger across the dashboard, leaving a clean streak through the dust, and noticed that the material lacked the grittiness of coal ash. It felt smooth, almost like powdered slate. He started the engine, which coughed twice before settling into a low, strained idle that sounded muffled, as though the exhaust pipe were submerged in deep water. The headlights flickered when he switched them on, their yellow beams cutting through the gathering dark, but failing to penetrate more than 10 feet into the dense, unmoving fog. According to his itinerary, the next checkpoint was Sector 12, a remote monitoring station located near the abandoned municipal playground on the edge of the woods. The drive was slow, his tires crunching over branches and pieces of dislodged asphalt that had tumbled down from the eroding hillsides. The road twisted through areas where the old town map indicated rows of neat suburban blocks. But nothing remained of the houses, except for occasional stone steps that led directly into thickets of wild blackberry bushes. Every few hundred yards, a state-installed monitoring pipe rose from the ground, its iron cap rusted shut and silent, venting no heat or gas into the night. When he reached the playground, the headlights illuminated a set of metal swings hanging motionless from a rusted crossbar, their chains completely still despite the breeze. Beside the sandbox stood a tall green weather tracking box, its wooden slats rotting away and its side door secured by a heavy brass padlock that bore the seal of the Department of the Interior. Raymond took his crowbar from the back of the wagon, inserted the flat edge into the latch, and pried it open with a sharp metallic snap. Inside the housing, the mechanical charts were still spinning, driven by a clockwork mechanism that had somehow survived decades without maintenance or winding. The paper reel was nearly exhausted, its white surface covered in a continuous, unbroken red line that didn't peak or valley, but remained perfectly straight at a value of 0. He touched the brass gears of the recording unit. They were freezing cold to the touch, coated in a sticky, transparent oil that didn't smell like regular industrial lubricant. A regular clicking sound drew his attention away from the weather box, originating from the dark woods just beyond the edge of the clearing. He turned his flashlight toward the tree line, the beam catching the pale trunks of birch trees that grew too close together to allow easy passage. The sound was rhythmic and dry, resembling the noise made by an old-fashioned telegraph key or a surveyor's chain being dragged across dry gravel at a steady, unhurried pace. Raymond called out into the darkness, his voice sounding flat and strangely small against the dense wall of trees, but the clicking did not stop or change its cadence. He took 3 steps toward the sound, his boots sinking into a carpet of pine needles that felt unusually spongy, as if the ground beneath them were hollow. The clicking grew louder, accompanied now by a faint metallic scraping that seemed to move parallel to him just beyond the first row of brush. He stopped when his flashlight beam hit a concrete monument marker half buried in the leaf litter, its face inscribed with the letters USGS and a serial number from 1972. This was the exact benchmark mentioned in the redacted section of his blue binder, the one that should have marked the farthest limit of the federal survey route. Below the stamped numbers, someone had used a chisel to score a deep horizontal line across the stone, effectively canceling the marker's official elevation reading. He knelt down to inspect the stone, noticing that the soil around the base of the monument had shrunk away, leaving a 2-inch gap that exposed the rough concrete footer. He lowered his flashlight into the crevice, expecting to see solid earth or gravel bedding, but the light revealed only a smooth vertical shaft that went down beyond the reach of his beam. There were no tool marks on the sides of the shaft. The dirt walls were perfectly circular and slick, as if they had been melted into place. The clicking sound abruptly ceased, leaving the woods so silent that Raymond could hear the tiny, distinct sound of droplets falling onto the dry leaves above him. He stood up, his knees cracking in the stillness, and looked back toward the station wagon parked 50 yards away in the clearing. The car's headlights, which had been bright a moment before, had dimmed to a dull amber glow that barely reached the edge of the gravel drive. He walked back to the vehicle, his movements deliberate and careful to avoid tripping over the exposed tree roots that seemed to crisscross the path in greater numbers than before. When he opened the driver's door, the interior dome light failed to illuminate, leaving the cabin in total darkness except for the faint glow of the dashboard clock. The digital display didn't show the time, but instead flashed a repeating sequence of 4 dashes, blinking in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Raymond sat behind the wheel, pulled Miller's journal from his pocket, and laid it open across his knees under the dim light of his failing flashlight. He turned to the section where the pages had been neatly extracted, studying the tiny remnants of handwriting left along the paper's edge. One word on the very last scrap was legible if held at a precise angle to the light: divergence, written in the same purple ink as the office memos. He closed the book and started the engine, which caught instantly this time with a high, unnatural whine that vibrated through the steering column and into his palms. He turned the vehicle around, intending to head back toward the state route and the safety of the main highway. But the road ahead looked unfamiliar in the dim headlights. The asphalt was gone, replaced by a wide, graded track of packed gray earth that didn't appear on any version of the maps he had studied that morning. The station wagon moved forward into the gray corridor, the tires making no sound against the packed earth as if the ground were absorbing the weight of the vehicle entirely. Raymond kept his eyes fixed on the odometer, watching the numbers click forward with agonizing slowness, while the landscape outside remained utterly unchanging. The birch trees on either side of the track grew perfectly straight and equidistant from one another, forming an artificial, rhythmic barrier that seemed to repeat every 50 yards like a looped film. He looked down at his clipboard, where the official Federal Survey map lay open under his thumb. The printed topography indicated they should be crossing a steep ravine right now, but the terrain outside remained flat, smooth, and featureless. He reached out to adjust the rearview mirror, but the silver backing had gone dark, reflecting nothing but a dull leaden surface that showed neither the interior of the car nor the road fading into the mist behind him. A mile down the track, the path opened into a vast circular clearing that wasn't marked on any regional chart from the last century. In the center of the expanse stood a massive concrete structure, shaped like a low, windowless bunker that had been partially swallowed by the encroaching earth. A series of thick black electrical cables emerged from the soil, snaking across the gravel and disappearing directly into a narrow slit in the bunker's heavy steel door. Raymond parked the car, leaving the engine running and the dim headlights cutting across the concrete facade. He approached the steel door, noticing that the metal was entirely free of rust or pitting, despite the dampness of the valley air. Above the latch, a small brass plate was riveted to the frame, stamped with the words Centralia Core Repository, Survey Sector 0. The text was crisp and sharp, showing none of the wear you would expect from a structure abandoned decades ago. He pulled on the heavy handle, which moved downward with a smooth, silent hydraulic hiss that suggested active maintenance. The door swung inward, revealing a long, narrow hallway illuminated by a row of low-voltage emergency lights that cast a pale green glow over the concrete walls. The air inside was completely stagnant, maintaining a precise, freezing temperature that made his knuckles ache as he gripped his flashlight. The hallway led to a central chamber filled with rows of tall steel library stacks. But instead of books, the shelves held thousands of narrow glass tubes. Raymond pulled one of the tubes from its slot, holding it up to the green light to inspect the contents. Inside was a core sample of solid rock, but it wasn't the dark, fractured anthracite coal native to the region. It was a uniform pale gray material that seemed to absorb the light from his torch. He turned the tube over, finding a small paper label affixed to the rubber stopper. The handwriting was identical to the neat clinical script in Miller's journal, dated August 14, 1984, months after the town had been officially condemned and evacuated. The entry on the label did not log a depth or a mineral composition, but instead recorded a single, precise measurement of 74 degrees, followed by the word stable. At the far end of the room sat a metal desk, its surface cleared of everything except for a single heavy telephone and a final, unsigned field note. The document was filed in a faded folder marked Schuylkill County Miscellaneous, a deliberate clerical error that would keep it hidden from anyone searching the Columbia County archives. Raymond picked up the page, the paper feeling heavy and brittle between his fingertips as he began to read the typed lines. The note detailed a final survey path taken on a section of road. According to all official state maps, this area had been entirely dug up and converted into a mine in 1970. The writing was brief, free of formal language, and it stopped in the middle of a sentence. The last full sentence stated, "The edge is not where we marked it, and the alteration is not what is affecting the valley." Raymond let the paper fall back onto the desk, the sound of its landing loud in the absolute silence of the underground room. He looked up at the ceiling, listening for the familiar, distant vibration of the subterranean fire he had felt earlier that morning, but found only a deep, hollow emptiness. He realized then that the silence wasn't the absence of sound, but a deliberate barrier that kept the rest of the world from looking too closely at what lay beneath the hills. He walked out of the bunker, leaving the door unlatched behind him, and climbed back into the station wagon. He didn't look at his maps or his compass anymore. He simply put the car in gear and drove toward the edge of the clearing where the gray track continued into the trees. The headlights caught a final, faded wooden sign at the edge of the woods, its letters completely blanked out by years of white ash. The road eventually joined back with the cracked asphalt of Route 61, just as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the tops of the ridge. Raymond didn't stop at the district office in Harrisburg, nor did he file the clipboard full of contradictory readings he had collected over the past 24 hours. He left the blue binder on the passenger seat of the unlocked wagon in the parking lot and walked away, knowing that some records are preserved best by never being completed. The files from the 1984 survey remain locked in the lower levels of the state archive, accessible only by specific administrative requests that are rarely approved. If you look at the modern satellite images of the valley, the trees appear to grow in neat, geometric patterns that defy the natural contours of the hills. Some places are erased not because they are dangerous, but because the lines we use to define them simply ran out of room.